Nomad PDU. Today I'm going to talk about getting a parallel solution out of your Nomad PDUs. So you might have multi-chemistry, which you do. You have MNC, which is the V5. So that's a 12.6 volt system. And then you can move on to the V5.5, the L series, the V6 HDs, 105s and 200 amp hour 135s. And they're all prismatic LiFePO4 14.6 volt. It's very important to understand the chemistry. It's very important to understand the different voltage profiles. They're not all the same, not all lithium's the same, regardless of what people tell you out in the field. A lot of people become instant experts and tell you that lithium should be charging at X, Y, Z, but there's about 40 different cathode, which is the chemistries and mixtures between the types of lithium there are. So the V5.5 is 14.6 volt. The V5 over there is 12.6 volt. So the 12.6 volt is a 12 volt system, okay, and it does pretty much everything you need to do anyway. But you might have, as we've seen now, a lot of people have multiples of these. Some people have 2 or 3 of the Nomad V5, and that's great. Now they've moved on to the V5.5 or EL series. So if you want to get a parallel solution, you can't direct connect them to each other. You've got to remember that parallel typically means you've got the same size battery, 2 of them, and they're batteries. The Nomad's not a battery. The Nomad is a PDU, power distribution unit. There are smarts inside. It has a BMS. It's not simply battery to connect battery to battery and let them flow across to each other. So what you've got to do here is use a DC-DC converter, a DC stabilizer, or DC-DC charger. Now typically they look like these. They're all the same. People call them different things, I guess, depending on the age and what you want to achieve out of it. So what I've got here is, you would have seen it before, we have a Sigma DC. Now what I want to talk about is stepping up and stepping down. So stepping up, if you've got a 12.6 volt system in the vehicle already and you want to connect up a 5.5 at 14.6, you have to step the voltage up. So what you've got, and you would have seen these before, is what I've got here is a step up or step down, depending how you use it. This is a 12.6 volt. So this is only a 5 amp Sigma DC. It's got 9 to 36 volt in, and this one's 14.6 volt, 5 amp out. So I can plug that happily into the vehicle and then plug that to my 5.5 and it's going to charge at 5 amp. But I'm going to use the V5 over there at the moment, and that is now my power source. So I'm going to plug it in like so. And then I'm going to take this here, which is taken now, 9 to 36 volt. The Nomad V5 is on 10.9 volt. So now it's going to provide the DC over here, stabilizer. And then I'm going to plug it into the 5.5. Now I could plug this into a 200 amp hour or the 135 L series, doesn't matter. You notice the V5 over there is now 6.72 amp. And over here you've got 5.1 amp or 5 amp. 6.7 down to 5 amp. So that's stepping it up to 14.6 volt. You're probably going to say, why is it showing 6 amp or 6.7 amp? The reason is there's always a conversion cost. Because that's stepping up, it has to draw more power to convert it to 14.6 because that's a lower voltage. If I switched them around and I had a 12.6 volt one of these and I was stepping it down from the LiFePO4, then it wouldn't be drawing as much amp. So you've got these in different sizes. You've got 5s, 10s and 20s. This one here, I just wanted to show you, is a 12.6 volt step up or step down, depends how you use it. 9 to 36 volt in, 12.6 volt out. Now if I was going to use this and connect it to the V5.5, it's now a step down because it's taken 9 to 36 volt in and converted it to 12.6. So if I had this in my vehicle, and you may have seen this in one of our podcasts before, we've got it in the back of Mercedes, you could run 2 or 3 of these together. Remember what's coming out and going in, what's coming out and going in, stabilize it with a DC stabilizer or voltage stabilizer, DC converter, whatever you want to call it, and then you're doing it safely and you're actually achieving a parallel solution. So it's not a real a traditional parallel, but it's doing exactly the same. One thing that I'll be doing is, if I was running it in my vehicle and I had a V5.5, I'd be charging it off, say, one of the larger DCs. That one's a 40 amp. I'd be charging this at, say, 40 amp in the vehicle, and then I'd use a step down, or you may already have a 12.6, one of the step ups for your V5. I just take that out. If this was a 12.6 profile, plug it in there and then plug it into the V5. All you've got to remember is try to keep it simple. It's really simply what's coming in, 9 to 36 volt. What's going out? Is it 14.6 or is it 12.6? What is the profile? So you could charge other things like AGM, lead acid or gel if you've got the profile correct. So what's coming in, what's going out. As long as you remember that and sit down and have a think about it, you'll be fine. Don't get all these sorts of modules lying all over the place, because what happens with people is they'll get them back to front and then they'll say, oh, it's not charging and so on. And I get this quite often. And I'll say, what are you charging from and to? And what they're doing is they've got it back to front and they're trying to charge incorrectly. So if you try and charge a V5 at 14.6, it's just going to overcharge it. And then you've got to disconnect the charge and then put a load on it for say 5 or 10 minutes, a heavy load, and that resets the BMS. It's covered in the instructions, but we still get calls where people are overcharging. So the V5 is a 12.6 profile, it's not 14.6. So don't be using your AC/DC charger like this, which is for the V5.5 or the L series. Don't be using that to charge a V5. And likewise, do not charge the V6 HDs or the L series or the V5.5, which are all LiFePO4. Don't use a 12.6 charger that you use on the V5 for these, because it won't charge. So all you've got to remember is to step up and step down. And then the great thing about it is that you don't have to use them as a master slave. You can call, say, if you're charging that from the vehicle or from solar, and then you're stepping it up to the V5.5, which is exactly what we're doing here. This is actually working right now. I can plug in whatever I want in here. I can run everything off this. Remember, that's a 50 amp output, and the V5s are a 20 amp max output. So quite a bit of difference. So remember, and this is important, if you're going to charge one of these from the V5, that's got a maximum of 20 amp output. These have a maximum charge of 50. You can't pull 50 out of that and put it in that, because then you're drawing too much, okay? And then it'll actually shut down. Remember what your ratings are. Please read instructions. If you don't have instructions, the instructions for the V5 and all the other ones are on our website. Go into the website, it'll say tutorials, instructions. You can download them all from there, please. So, the V5s, the L series, all those at prismatic 14.6 volt charge profile. Again, stepping up, stepping down. So if my stabilizer like this says 12.6 output, then it's suitable to charge the V5. If it says 14.6 output, it's suitable to charge the L series. And that's all you've got to remember. The one thing I will point out though, is that if you're using a Siga DC like this, which is 14.6, did you notice it's pulling 6.76 amp? If you made a Siga DC up of this with a 14.6 output, and it was a 10 amp module, and you plug into a 10 amp socket in your vehicle, if it's only rated 10 amp, it's probably going to pull about 12 to 13 amp, and that can actually burn the socket out in the vehicle. So we don't do a 10 amp 14.6 volt profile with a Siga on it. What we would do is we'd have Andersons like this, and we'd say, look, make sure that you're in your vehicle, you've got an Anderson if you're going to be charging from that. But you can get the DC converters, which are Anderson to Anderson, and this is what I'd be using if I had it in my vehicle. I'd be connecting this to my L series, and I'd connect that to say the V5 and charge it and convert it over by say 20 amp. But you've got to remember, if you're only running a fridge or two fridges, don't get carried away with the charge rate and try to transfer as much as you can. If you're transferring say 10 amp between one of these and that, or the V5 to the V6 or the HDs, doesn't really matter, because you've got a hell of a lot of power there, and you've got to remember that lithium runs right down flat. When I'm talking about running flat, when you talk about charging, what will happen is you notice a lot of DC charges when you charge your vehicle. If your car is dead flat, you notice the DC sometimes won't work, because there's actually no current left in that battery. It's just not going to pick it up. Even with this was on 000, and it worked fine off one of these DCs, but I'm pretty sure that if I plug the DC from the vehicle on a dead flat Nomad, it may not pick it up. So what I'll have to do is put a little bit of a charger with my AC/DC, or even one of these, because you don't really care. They haven't got the smarts, so just basically allowing current to go through. It'll just let that go through. Even when that's plugged in to one of these and there's no load on it, it'll still show me the voltage. And then when you connect it, it'll charge up that. So basically just remember that when a battery is dead flat, it's quite common that those DC/DCs in vehicles, even the big name brands, doesn't matter, they typically don't pick up when the battery is dead flat. You might need something like one of these, or you might need the AC/DC just to give it a little bit of a charge, so that the DC/DC can pick it up. So running multiple Nomads in parallel, you can run them, like you could run 3 of these together. If I wanted to, I could grab, this one's charging that at 14.6, okay? If I want to charge another V5.5, I could. I'd take another one of these, plug it into the Siga, and plug it into another V5.5. So I'm going to go from the Noma V5 to the 5.5, which is a step up. And then you might say, well, that's not a step up, it's just going to the same profile. It is. it takes 9 to 36 volt in and converts to what you want. This one takes 9 to 36 volt and converts to 24 volt. And I use that when I'm actually running my aircon. I've got a 24 volt aircon, and I use that to step it up. You've got to also remember that when you're running the aircon might draw 22 amp. I can't run a 10 amp one of these. I need to run a 25 or 30 amp one of them and step it up. But remember, there's always conversion cost when you convert from PV or from, say, battery to an inverter, and you step it up. So your converters in your house, inverters in your home, for an example, when you bring it from the sun and you put it into the battery, or you put it into the inverter, and the inverter steps it up to 240 volt. It's very common in the home when you go to the downlight has a little DC converter. It converts it back to 12 volt. You actually got two conversion costs. You could be losing 50% in efficiency because you're doing it up and down. What if you just connected directly to the light? You would have saved those conversions. So it's just something to remember. And the simple rule of thumb is what's coming in, what's going out. Read the back of the DC, voltage stabilizer, DC module, DC converter, whatever it is, what's coming in, what's going out. As long as you get them right and the profile right, the charge profile, then you'll be fine. So that's when you want to run multiple nomads of multi-chemistries. Doesn't really matter, as long as you get what's going in, what's going out correct, and you use something like that, that's for lithium. And then if you're going to run something like an AGM lead acid or gel, make sure that what's coming out of the nomad would be going to the converter, and then it's converted to the right profile for your AGM or whatever, if it's 13.3 or 13.8. And that's just a rule of thumb. It's just the things to remember. So if you get confused, send us an email to contact@nomadpdu.com.au. But this should not be confusing. Get yourself a DC converter, look it up online. You can get your modules here. We can make them up for you if you send us a contact at. What do you want to do? What do you want to achieve? And what's the transfer rate that you want to get, if it's a 10 amp and so on. 10 amp 20s, typically you can get 20s like this in 12.6 or 14.6 profile. And I would typically use the larger battery as a DC in the vehicle as the charge source, and then step it down to the V5. However, I've got one in the vehicle where I've got a V5 stepping to 135, works perfectly fine, and you can use all the outputs at the same time. You don't have to treat one as a true master or slave. So that's running in parallel with Nomad, using DC converters, DC voltage stabilizers. Any questions, Nomad